This installation involves the installation of a DH123D wired decoder in a Athearn Blue Box GP40-2 locomotive. We first remove our locomotive from the box, set the box aside. We next remove the shell of the locomotive by squeezing the center right in this area and releasing 4 clips. You squeeze and wiggle and the shell will come off. Set the shell aside. Then we remove our decoder from the package. First the decoder, then the wire harness. We first remove this metal strap from the top of the motor that goes underneath the 2 L brackets on each truck by simply sliding the bracket out from under the first L bracket, slipping it forward, and it's off. We can discard that because we will no longer use it. The next thing that we want to do is to remove the motor, to electrically isolate it, and to solder the negative motor contacts on the bottom of the motor. The motor simply slips right out by just slightly wiggling it and lifting it to the top. Temporarily you can remove the 2 motor mounts. We need to remove these 2 tabs that go down from this bracket and touch the frame, making electrical contact with the negative side of the motor. Once that is done, we need to connect our gray negative motor wire to this bracket. Since we're going to solder this wire to this bracket, the most prudent thing to do would be to remove the bracket from the motor. You simply pry one end of the bracket up, lift it, being careful not to lose that spring. You can then hold the bracket with an alligator clip in this instance. Clean the bracket so it can be easily soldered. I use a motor brush, wire brush on a rotary. Use a small amount of flux. Strip a small amount of insulation from your wire. In this case, I'm going to use my extra alligator clip to hold the wire while I tin the wire. I then use my soldering iron, place it on the wire, come in with my solder, and I've got my wire soldered, tinned. I then also tin the bracket. So I have my tinned wire, I have my tinned bracket. I then place the wire on the bracket. Check my solder. We do have a good connection. I then take the bracket, slip it back down over the motor, making sure the spring is in place. We can now replace our motor in the frame. To ensure that the motor remains electrically isolated from the frame, I've added a small piece of Kapton tape so that the motor can't possibly make electrical contact where it used to. You can use most any kind of tape. I had the Kapton tape, so I've used it. You can use electrical tape, you could use Scotch tape, just about anything to make sure that you have the motor insulated from the frame. I've now reinstalled the motor into the frame, making sure that our drive line is secure. And next we are going to solder the orange decoder wire to the motor positive on this clip. We will solder the red wire to this L bracket and this L bracket for our right side track pickups. We will solder our black wire to this bracket that is attached to the frame for our left side track pickups. And we will solder our white wire to this contact that goes to the back of the headlight. I'm going to prepare our brackets for solder by first cleaning them with my wire brush. I will then use flux to further prepare these parts for solder. I am then going to tin these parts to receive the wire by again applying heat to those parts and touching the solder to those parts. And when the part is hot enough, the solder will flow to it. As you can see with this bracket, okay, finally got some solder there. We now tin our positive motor wire. And solder it to the top motor clip. You notice I was in and out in about 2 to 3 seconds. We now have the decoder harness wired to our motor. We're next going to solder our red wire to our 2 L brackets coming from the right side track pickups on the trucks. We first tin one end of the wire. then solder one end of the wire to one of the brackets. We then determine what length we need. We cut the wire stripping the other end. Tinning that end. And attaching that wire to our bracket. We then strip a small bit off of the remaining red wire on the wire harness and tin it. And then also soldering it to the second L bracket. We now have good solder joints for our red track pickup wire. We will now solder the black track pickup wire to the bracket at the front of the locomotive. Stripping a small bit of the insulation off. Tinning the wire. And soldering the wire to the bracket. We finally solder the white headlight wire to the contact point behind the headlight. Again, tinning our wire. And finally, soldering the wire to the bracket. Our soldering is now complete. We have our red and black track pickup wires soldered. We have our orange and gray motor wires soldered, and we have our white headlight wire soldered. As for the remaining wires, we are not going to use the purple and the green wires, so we're going to clip those off. And we will use the yellow and the blue wires for our rear light. We will solder those two wires directly to the light bulb itself to be mounted in the rear of the locomotive shell. Next, we're going to install the decoder on the 9-pin harness. And after I solder the blue and the yellow wires to the rear light, I'm going to place the decoder on top of the motor, and I'm going to use a piece of tape to tape the motor in place, along with the wires to make them neat. Once all our connections are made, we simply reinstall the shell by slipping it over, making sure all the wires are tucked in and not caught by our mounting pins. And we're snapped back down nice and tight. Finally, we place our locomotive on the test track, select address 3, and make sure it will run and that our lights work. And this concludes this installation video.